26th of October, our top stories tonight. China reports its biggest outbreak of coronavirus in 4 months as tensions boil over in Europe after strict measures to curb the second wave come into force. Thai protesters pile the pressure on the Prime Minister to resign, and the Morrison government demanding answers from Qatar after several Australian women were strip searched. You're watching The World. Also tonight, fighting obesity and diabetes in the Pacific. I'll talk to Tonga's Health Minister. Well, as Victorians here celebrate the life of lifting of restrictions, countries that have had similar success in driving down infection numbers are still wary of COVID-19 and how quickly it can spread. After the early days of the pandemic, China's response has been swift and sometimes heavy-handed. But today it's had its worst outbreak in 4 months, with more than 130 cases detected in far western Xinjiang. Authorities have shut down transport to the frontier city of Kashgar and claim they've tested almost 3 million people in just 2 days. Officials say the drastic measures were prompted by a positive test from a 17-year-old girl living and working in a garment factory. The testing blitz revealed another 136 positive cases in the city, and officials claim none of them have symptoms. The outbreak is the biggest in China since June and comes despite heavy-handed tracking and prevention measures. And we'll talk to our correspondent, Bill Birtles, shortly. Meantime, frustrations are boiling over in Europe, where tens of thousands of new infections are being reported every day, and governments there reimpose strict measures to combat this second wave. In Naples, protesters threw stones and bottles at police, who responded with tear gas. The riot comes after a nighttime curfew was imposed in the region. The country's Prime Minister says while he understands the anger over the new measures, he's condemned the latest violence.
If I were on the other side today, I would certainly have reason to grieve. I too would probably feel anger towards the government's measures, even if I say wait and see what the economic measures are that we have decided on, because I believe they are at the very least adequate. So the protest is there, but what I can hope for is to be careful, because clearly there are some groups, even antagonists, let's say professionals, who are trying to fuel the tension.
Meantime, the US infectious diseases expert Dr. Anthony Fauci says it'll be clear by early December whether the race to produce a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccine has been successful. But Dr. Fauci says the next challenge will be getting enough vaccine to allow for widespread vaccination.
The amount of doses that will be available in December will not certainly be enough to vaccinate everybody. You'll have to wait several months into 2021.
Campaigning is in full swing before next week's presidential election, even as the country grapples with record infection rates of around 80,000 a day. The President and the First Lady greeted trick-or-treaters in a Halloween tradition on the White House lawn, while the Vice President, Mike Pence, has announced he'll not reduce his appearances on the campaign trail, despite a new COVID-19 outbreak among his staff. There's been more cautious optimism on the vaccine front after early results from the one being developed by Oxford University and AstraZeneca shows it produces a robust immune response in the elderly. The Financial Times is reporting the vaccine triggers protective antibodies and T cells in older age groups who are at the greatest risk of illness or death from the virus. Details of the findings are expected to be published shortly in a clinical journal. But the report cautions that such positive tests don't guarantee the vaccine will ultimately prove safe and effective. And in Victoria, it's the news they've all been waiting for, a day of zeros and the lifting of Melbourne's lockdown. It's the first time since early June there have been no new cases and no COVID deaths. There are still 91 active cases, but today was for breathing a collective sigh of relief and daring to imagine life in Melbourne after lockdown. Here's state political reporter Bridget Rollison.
Today was declared the state's unofficial Donut Day, Victorians sweetly celebrating something we haven't seen in 139 days.
and there are 0 new cases across our state.
We opened up at midday. There's about 30 people at the door. And then we looked online and saw that it's a declared donut day because of 0 cases. And we sold out in the first hour.
That number enabled the Premier to deliver Melburnians some other treats.
We are able to say that now is the time to open up. Now is the time to congratulate every single Victorian for staying the course.
I'm ecstatic. I'm so excited. It's been almost 8 months that we've been closed.
For the first time in months, Melburnians won't need a reason to leave home, and all Melbourne shops, including beauticians, will reopen on Wednesday. Cafes, restaurants and bars will open with a maximum of 20 people inside and 50 outdoors. Weddings will increase to 10 people and funerals to 20 mourners. Religious services have been online only, but can now have 10 people indoors and 20 outdoors. Outdoor gatherings are still a maximum of 10 people. But there's now no limit on the number of households. The 25-kilometre limit remains in place, but if case numbers keep coming down, it should be lifted on the 9th of November, along with Melbourne's Ring of Steel, but it won't be in time for the Melbourne Cup weekend.
We still don't want a situation where people are travelling the length and breadth of the city, and we don't want a situation where people, it's not a criticism, it's just a natural thing, people are attracted to places of great beauty.
We're going to miss the Cup weekend, which is a bit of a shame because we've got 24,000 holiday homes in the Mornington Peninsula, and so people come down on the Cup weekend to get ready for summer.
And for large hospitality venues, only allowing 10 inside offers little comfort.
But in all honesty, 36 hours isn't enough to prep the food we need to open.
There'll be scars on the psyche of this state that will not heal. There are many, many people whose lives have changed permanently because of what they've had to endure over the last few months.
It was an emotional day for Victorians, and the Premier was no different. His voice cracking as he congratulated everyone for all they've given up over the past few months, waiting for this day. But Daniel Andrews says he'll be skipping the beers for his celebration tonight.
I might go a little higher up the shelf.
Bridget Willison, ABC News, Melbourne.
A fast-moving typhoon has forced thousands of villagers to flee to safety in parts of southern Philippines. Wind gusts of up to 180 kilometres an hour swept the region, uprooting trees and damaging homes. Whole villages have also been flooded. There are no immediate reports of casualties, but 12 fishermen remain missing. At least 25,000 villagers have been displaced by Typhoon Molavi. And Thailand's parliament has begun a special session to address increasing calls by protesters for the Prime Minister to resign. But demonstrators say the government's efforts are insincere, with the debate not really dealing with their concerns. Today they're rallying in front of the German embassy to petition Berlin to investigate the King's use of his powers. Here's Yvonne Yong.
A special session of Parliament called by Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha after emergency measures earlier this month, including a ban on rallies, only inflamed anger, bringing out tens of thousands of protesters onto the streets of Bangkok.
I, in the name of the Cabinet and Government, know that we have to change with the times of the present world. But we have to admit that in Thailand, millions, tens of millions of people do not want to see change through chaos. Therefore, we must creatively find a balance between the needs of the individual and others in society.
But the leader of the opposition Pheu Thai party says it's the Prime Minister who is a major obstacle and burden to the country and must go.
To set an agenda like this only compounds the situation and is not a solution for society. However, we still intend to use this opportunity to offer and find the best solution for the country.
Pressure is mounting on the government as the deadline given by protesters for the Prime Minister to resign passed over the weekend. They're also demanding a more democratic constitution and reforms to the monarchy.
This protest is not about trying to overthrow the monarchy. We are just want the freedom to talk about anything.
I don't know when we will win, but if we don't fight, we will lose. All we have are our ideas, our words and our two bare hands. That's all we can do.
Protesters today are marching to the German embassy to put pressure on Berlin to investigate the king's use of power from within the European country. He reportedly spends the majority of his time at a retreat in the Bavarian Alps and only returns to Thailand for brief visits. The German government has said it would be unacceptable to conduct politics from there. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
Australia's Foreign Minister has condemned the treatment of female passengers at a Doha airport earlier this month as grossly disturbing after a newborn baby was discovered abandoned in a terminal bathroom. 18 women, including 13 Australians, were asked to disembark a Sydney-bound flight, with some subjected to invasive examinations. As political editor Andrew Probyn explains, the Morrison government is demanding answers from Qatari authorities.
Passengers for Qatar Airways.
Qatar Airways Flight 908 to Sydney is one of the few available for stranded Australians trying to get home. For most travellers, Doha's a transit point. For Rachel, it was supposed to be a 3-hour stopover until
the authorities, Qatar authorities, boarded the plane and asked all the women on the plane to leave.
Rachel, as we'll call her, was among a dozen or so Australian women escorted through the terminal to the tarmac, where ambulances were waiting, greeted by a woman in a mask and gloves.
She asked me to drop my trousers and that she would need to do an internal examination. I didn't know why, and I think that was the scariest part.
Rachel initially refused and made her way to the other women. One of them told her authorities were searching for the mother of a newborn baby, found abandoned in an airport bathroom.
I don't think anyone necessarily willingly gave permission. It was sort of almost being bribed to be able to get back to your own country.
Rachel and most of the women eventually complied.
Everyone was quite shocked. I think everyone was shaken to a degree.
This is a grossly disturbing, offensive, concerning set of events.
Australia's Foreign Minister adamant the women could not have given free and informed consent in the circumstances. Are you suggesting that the women were sexually assaulted?
No, Andrew, I'm not suggesting that because I have not seen the detailed report of the events.
You talked of consent.
But in terms of the consent to a physical examination by medical professionals, that does raise significant concerns, yes.
This effectively amounts to state-sanctioned sexual assault.
The incident's been reported to the federal police, but it's doubtful they have the jurisdiction to properly investigate. Australia's lodged its serious concerns with the Qatari ambassador and is demanding authorities in Doha complete their report by week's end. If the Morrison government's planning a formal response, it's not yet saying. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Returning to our top story, in China's Xinjiang region has seen a surge in the amount of COVID cases, with officials launching a testing blitz. China correspondent Bill Birtles says authorities are working hard to suppress the new spike.
Well, Bev, this appears to be the largest outbreak of coronavirus in mainland China since June. Back in June, there were more than 200 cases in Beijing. Now we know in Xinjiang, in Kashgar, there have been to date about 137 cases. And what's interesting is the way the local authorities in Kashgar are framing this. They're saying that over the weekend there was a 17-year-old young woman who worked in a garment factory and lived in a garment factory and went home or was allowed to go home every 2 weekends. So this is actually, people obviously wonder in Xinjiang, if you're living at some sort of work factory, does that indicate that it may be linked to the internment detention camp program that they have for minority Muslims there? But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the case, because it's quite common in China for people who are working in factories to reside in dormitories at those factories. So we're not quite clear on that situation, but a few people have raised questions, at least, whether or not the facility is linked. And since that case, now we don't know why they were testing in the first place, but since that case, authorities now claim they've tested almost 3 million people over the past 48 hours or so, finding another 137 confirmed cases. Here's the interesting thing, Bev. They claim all 137 people are asymptomatic. Now, why is this important in China? Because officials do not count cases as confirmed unless they are showing symptoms. It is therefore probably in the interests of local officials to claim cases are asymptomatic, because technically it means there are 0 confirmed cases. Doesn't matter though. In the end, you have close to 140 positive tests, and now authorities there are talking about trying to continue this mass testing program to try and get almost 5 million residents in total of Kashgar tested rapidly.
And when you talk about those tests in the millions in a few short days, it gives you the sense of how China is handling this pandemic, and potentially how they've been able to contain it in a population of 1.4 billion people.
Yeah, if you look at the maps put out by China's government, there are cases in other provinces. Recently, there was an outbreak in the eastern city of Qingdao. Today, if you look at the map, for example, there are cases in central Shanxi, there are cases in southern Guangdong. Many of the cases, though, according to the authorities at least, are travellers, or not travellers, Chinese nationals usually returning to China from abroad. But this is by far and away the biggest domestic transmission case. China's government copped a lot of flack internationally for the initial cover-up and for initial efforts by local authorities in Wuhan to talk down the human-to-human transmission that was going on back in January or December, late last year. The reality, though, Bev, is since then you have a densely populated country of 1.4 billion people where, give or take, they've basically suppressed the virus. It is actually quite incredible. And the fact that this Xinjiang outbreak has prompted such a massive response, even though it is a number of cases that pales in comparison to the daily tallies we're seeing in Europe and the US, that says a lot about how aggressive China has been in combating the virus.
They've also backed several vaccines that are still relatively for a vaccine early on in development, yet people seem quite eager to line up and get a jab.
Yeah, well, this is very aggressive too, but it's a lot more controversial, certainly from outside of China, with health experts looking at what's going on. You have anywhere from, I think, about 3 to about half a dozen Chinese vaccine companies now already in phase 3 trials. There are phase 3 trials going on with some of the other vaccine makers in Europe and the US as well. But what's really interesting about the Chinese approach is authorities have basically allowed some of these manufacturers to give these experimental vaccines to huge numbers of people in China. They can't actually do the phase 3 trials in China because not enough people have coronavirus to actually work out whether it is effective if people are injected and then go into a population where there is a large amount of the disease. So instead, they've been giving these experimental vaccines up to sort of 60,000 in one case of one of the vaccines to frontline medical workers, to Chinese nationals who go overseas to work for some state-owned enterprise projects in other countries. So they've really been rolling it out in a way that some Western observers have raised eyebrows about, because it still is at an experimental stage. But obviously Beijing believes that speed is of the essence to try and get things back to normal, and so they're willing to take that risk.
Great to have you back on board, Bill. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Bev.
Well, the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has landed in New Delhi, where he begins his tour of Asia to strengthen security ties. He and Defence Secretary Mark Esper join their counterparts for the 3rd annual US-India 2+2 ministerial dialogue. It's part of Washington's latest efforts to bolster allies against China. The next stops will be Sri Lanka, the Maldives and lastly Indonesia. Hundreds of Lebanese have fled the country this year to make the treacherous crossing to Europe by boat. Nearly half of those left in the 6 weeks after the devastating Beirut port blast in August that killed nearly 200 people. It was the last straw for many already struggling because of the banking crisis, currency crash and rising poverty. Middle East correspondent Eric Torchek and Beirut producer Shireen Yazbek filed this report.
These Lebanese men have nearly made it halfway across the Mediterranean to Italy. They're some of the hundreds who've left by boat in the last few months, escaping an economic crisis and financial collapse. Most went to the nearest European Union country, Cyprus, 170 kilometres away. The rate of Lebanese leaving greatly increased after the Beirut blast.
is the first time that we've seen such huge numbers of Lebanese nationals trying to leave Lebanon.
But many, like Mohammed, don't make it. The 18-month-old died from dehydration when the boat carrying him ran out of fuel.
I didn't think we were taking a big risk and that we would end this journey with my baby dying. We tried, just like many other people, to flee to a European country to find a new life. But this was our fate, losing my child and coming home without him.
As poverty and desperation rise, many Lebanese are still willing to take the risk.
The reasons why people are fleeing are not going away. In fact, we expect to see those reasons increase as people are expecting the situation to get worse and worse.
Since the end of its civil war, Lebanon's been known as a country that sheltered refugees rather than generated them. Not anymore. There's no money, there's no work, and by the end of the year, aid groups say many Lebanese will need food. Lebanon's been through many crises, but this looks like one of its worst. Eric Twarchek, ABC News.
Millions of Chileans are celebrating tonight after voters approved a plan to replace the country's Pinochet-era constitution. Residents all over the country poured into their city centres to mark the historic decision, which saw about 78% of voters favour a new constitution. It was one of the key demands that sparked massive anti-government protests last year. Around 7.5 million votes were cast, the highest turnout since Chile made voting voluntary in 2012. Well, problem gambling affects every corner of society, but for Australia's migrant community, seeking help can be even more difficult. Social isolation is just one of many reasons why migrants may be more susceptible to gambling addiction. Producer Michael Lee and reporter Sean Manteso has the story.
At the height of his addiction, recovered gambling addict Paul lost nearly $1 million in just over a week.
I transferred the money into a betting account and I gambled it all within 10 days. It was gone.
He didn't start gambling seriously until he was in his early 20s. But Paul says as a child, he would watch his parents and their friends play the game of mahjong, a popular form of gambling among the Chinese diaspora.
When I remembered as a child, that's what I felt when I gambled. When I won, the thrill of winning.
Paul eventually overcame his addiction and now volunteers to help Chinese Australians regain control of their lives.
Immigrants from Asia and China or Vietnam are at a higher risk of gambling problem due to huge changes in their lives.
Research conducted by the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation says the stress of migration, social isolation and a lack of education or employment were reasons some migrants turn to gambling. And experts warn a culture of shame and secrecy could prevent them from seeking help.
They think it is shame, shamed of their own failure, just want to cover it up. They'll not tell anybody.
For Joey Lee, that's a familiar story.
My father had gambling problems. That's what really affected me. So, and my mom and dad, because of the gambling problems, they always argue.
It wasn't until Joey's mother threatened to leave and take the children with her that finally her father sought help.
Much better. I can feel the love, and my mom and dad can be have more communication, and there are more smiles on my mom's face.
Counselling service Each is providing support and services for Australia's multicultural communities.
It is delivered by trained volunteers who have been through their own trouble with gambling.
Gamblers, including those in migrant communities, are encouraged to seek help if they need it. Sean Manteso, ABC News.
Thousands of protesters have rallied in the Pakistan city of Quetta overnight, calling on Prime Minister Imran Khan to resign. The Pakistan Democratic Movement is a coalition of 11 opposition parties who say the government was undemocratically elected and has failed to manage the economy after the coronavirus lockdowns. Yesterday's rally was almost called off after an explosion in Quetta killed 4 people earlier in the day. Let's get more. I'm joined by journalist Alia Zera in Karachi. Alia, thank you very much for your time. What's been driving these anti-government protests?
So the 11-member opposition alliance, the Pakistan Democratic Movement, it aims to bring an end to military's interference in politics. And they say that the current government of Prime Minister Imran Khan was undemocratically selected by the military establishment. So this is what basically, prompted them to come out on the streets. They say that the military has been unfairly, interfering, and they have been, violating their oaths, and they are, practicing overreaches. So what actually this came after a long, we can say, silence on their part. The opposition had taken this position ever since the government came into power in 2018. But they were not being able to mobilize, and we did not see this kind of consensus that we are seeing now. But then, after 2 years, they, all of them joined hands, all the opposition parties, and after a multi-party conference in Islamabad, they decided to form this alliance, the PDM.
How unusual is that kind of alliance for all those opposition parties to come together? And will that have a greater impact than just protesters from, coming out of the streets, so to speak?
So there have been instances of such alliances in the past as well. They have joined hands in the past, but the clarity which we're seeing now has been missing in the past. The way the openness with which they have been calling out the military establishment lately, this is unprecedented for Pakistan in the recent times. And we have not seen any opposition leader clearly naming, the military leadership, which is, the elephant in the room, basically. So in this way, they are different. In the past, whenever they took to the streets, they only criticized the Imran Khan government and did not directly name the military. But now, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif also named the Chief of the Army Staff, Qamar Javed Bajwa, and the head of the Inter-Services Intelligence, General Faiz, and he directly blamed them for manipulating the 2018 elections and bringing Imran Khan into power. So this way it is different. And in the past, when they came out on the streets, people were, there were speculations as to whether they're out there to get a deal from the establishment, whether they're trying to, pressurize the establishment into selecting them instead of Imran Khan. But now it is clear that, what Nawaz Sharif has said, he has actually brought himself to a point of no return by directly naming the, military leadership. He has actually made it clear that they're not out there for a deal, but they actually want to, bring an end to this practice, this unconstitutional practice of military's interference in politics.
Yeah. More broadly, what has been the analysis of Imran Khan's period as president?
So Imran Khan's government has been actually unable to, clearly they have not been able to deliver on their promises. And especially the economic mess that the country is in currently, that is absolutely, it has been their supporters have been disappointed, and even those who voted for this government, they're disappointed, and the rising inflation, the rising prices of essential commodities. And this is all basically, it has all created a sense of disappointment among the public, which is why the opposition parties are able to mobilize support. And much of what the opposition parties are saying about the Imran Khan government's inability to govern, it resonates with the public at large, because we have seen people losing jobs over the past 2 years after the Imran Khan government came into power. There have been a financial crunch. There has been this economic crisis in the country, and it appears that the Imran Khan government, his economic team, they're just not experienced enough to resolve these issues. So this way, it has the opposition has been able to get support.
Yeah, and when he was elected Prime Minister, he vowed that if there were protests and opposition to his government, he'd step aside. Do you think he's going to?
Resign. Yeah, so he was actually, this is something that is very important. He had actually said that even if a handful of people came out against him, and he would resign as Prime Minister. So this means that the government is actually losing its moral authority by the day. Currently everyone, on the streets, we see huge protests calling for Prime Minister Imran Khan's resignation. So, whether or not these protests will be successful is anybody's, guess at this stage. But people calling for his resignation, it is clearly, it clearly means that he's losing the moral authority to rule, which is something significant, I think.
Indeed. Alia Zera, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Well, a young couple has tied the knot at a cathedral in Nagorno-Karabakh, offering a brief respite from the conflict that's been raging in the region for the past month. Dressed in his military uniform, the soldier didn't seem to mind the holes in the roof as he professed his love to his bride at a church that was heavily shelled just a fortnight ago. The young trooper had taken 2 days off from the front line to say his I do's in front of many guests, including an Armenian MP who attended the event. The region's president has also congratulated the couple through a message on social media. Now to what in the world, and we've all seen those incredibly long lines outside early polling places across the United States. But in Philadelphia, some groups are trying to turn that negative into a positive. Videos showing dozens of voters dancing as they wait in line have been doing the rounds on social media. The campaign was created by several groups, including election defenders who are trying to combat voter suppression. With white supremacy and intimidation tactics creeping into this year's campaign, activists and artists have teamed up to promote and celebrate voting in a fun and COVID-safe way.